you. Okay, let's dedicate today's learning to the memory of Abraham Yeshaya ben, I forget, his neshama should have an aliyah. Okay, we're up to chapter 48.
Tzvi Hirsch.
Tzvi Hirsch, Abraham Yeshaya ben Tzvi Hirsch, his neshama should have an aliyah.
Amen.
Okay, chapter 48. Before I speak, I'd like to say a few words. So there's a story told about the Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe that I think sheds some light onto today's chapter of Tanya, which is an ongoing sort of discussion about what is the stature and what is the value of telling stories of the greatness of the Rabbeim, the miracles and their great scholarship and so on, so to speak. Why do we talk about this? So they say that in the times of the Alter Rebbe, the stories were falling on the floor. So here again, there's two ways that we can understand this. One is there were so many of them that they were falling all on the floor because there were so many, or because they understood that that's not what's important about the Rebbe, is to say the great miracles that they were able to perform. So they left them on the floor. And of course, both perspectives are true, because even though, as the Alter Rebbe writes much later, it is not the role of the tzaddik to help people with their material needs, it's the role to help them with their spiritual needs. Nevertheless, we find, for example, that Shaul HaMelech, King Saul, the way that he met up with Shmuel the prophet is because King Saul, was looking for his lost donkeys. So he went to Shmuel. So whence we see that it was always historically part of the role of the leader to go also to be approached also for the material well-being of the people. The reason why I bring this up is because this chapter 48, is continuing the theme of how we can gin up our love for Hashem using the strategy of, like the pasuk says, as the water reflects the face, so does one person reflect another. That is, water like a mirror. When you look in it, you see whatever you put in front of it. So too, the way one person treats another person evokes naturally, even effortlessly, that the beneficiary will respond to the benefactor in the same manner. So if someone treats you with kindness, you, again, naturally, effortlessly respond with kindness of the same format. So we've talked about the kindnesses of Hashem. So we talked about the kindness of Hashem, that he engages us, gives us an opportunity to be in a relationship with him, the metaphor of the king who pulls the person out of the trash heap and gives them purpose and meaning and alignment and so on. We talked about in the last chapter how Hashem gives us an opportunity for a daily personal release from our sufferings and mitzrayims through Torah study, through access to Hashem. In this chapter, the Alter Rebbe is taking a similar, though somewhat different approach, and he's going to use as another mechanism to engage us in our service of Hashem, that we should recognize not only all that Hashem does for us, which is one strategy, but another strategy, which is a little, I'm going to call it risky, because if a person doesn't have reverence for it, they could potentially even take advantage of it. And that is that Hashem goes through so much effort to create this world, which is primarily through the process of tzimtzum, which we'll talk about what that is in some detail, not a lot, because it is so crucial to Hashem to create this world, to create us, to be in a connected relationship with us, to give us, and by us I mean not only us, the Jewish people, even the Gentile world, the whole world, all of creation, angels, trees, animals, and so forth, an opportunity to fulfill the purpose for which Hashem created them, and to be in a meaningful personal relationship with Hashem. Because it's so important to Hashem, he goes through this great difficult process, which again, we call it tzimtzum, and we'll talk about that. And this is not designed as I mean, semi-silly, as a guilt trip. Look how much I do for you, and don't you appreciate it? But it illustrates how important it is to Hashem and for Hashem that he be in a relationship with us, that he is goes through. I was going to say willing, but that's not even the right word. He goes through all of this strain and difficulty in the pursuit and the anticipation of being able to create a world that can have its own identity and can voluntarily engage in a healthy, godly relationship and relationship with Hashem. Now, a little bit we're going to talk about Tzimtzum. The Alter Rebbe is careful, as we'll note, that this is not the place for an academic analysis of Tzimtzum. But let's talk a little bit. I mean, we've certainly spoken about it in previous chapters, but let's talk for a few minutes about what is this idea of Tzimtzum and why it's so, and I keep using this word, laborious for Hashem. So there is an essential dividing point between the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and all other philosophers, let's use that word, theologians, who preceded him. And this dispute goes on until this very day. And it's all centered around the manner in which we understand the conceptual idea of Tzimtzum, and how it manifests itself. Now, whether we recognize it, we in the generic sense, academically, or we just recognize it intuitively, it's all centered around this core distinction between the Baal Shem Tov and everyone else. And when I say others, I'm including Rambam and other philosophers. So, certainly people who know what they're talking about, as we would say. So, again, another step backwards. There is a fundamental theological question. How does an infinite Hashem create a finite world? In the current parshas, when Paro says to Moshe, I do not know Havaya, Yudke Vavke, he's not saying I never heard of gods, because the Egyptians had gods. And it's not like, well, I have your God, you have my God, because that Paro knows. Paro knows every culture and community has their own God. And so far, nobody's God has been stronger than Paro's God, as evidenced by the fact that when everyone else is starving, the Egyptians are sated. They're eating. So when Paro says, I do not know Havaya, he's not saying, I never happen to have heard of this God. There's the God of the Philistines and the God of the Hittites and so on. What he's saying is that Moshe Rabbeinu's presentation that Hashem is infinite, this I never heard of. Because every God is finite. It's finite in its ability. Even if you say it's the strongest, you're still defining it to the relative virtues of others, and you're still characterizing it by strength. It doesn't speak at all to any other characteristic. So the contention, the presentation of Moshe that Hashem is infinite, this is what Paro never heard of it and can't get his arms around, because we can't imagine something that's infinite. It's almost a tautology. If I say, well, what does infinite look like? As soon as we start to explain what it looks like, we have fallen into the trap. Because if I start to describe it with a color, with a character, even if I describe infinite as undescribable, I have, and this sounds like wordplay, I understand, that I have fallen into the trap of giving it a description. It's describable as indescribable. So we can't even describe Hashem as without limitation, because then you're putting a limitation. A manner in which this manifests itself, a true story. There was once this preschool teacher, and she taught the kids the song. You probably heard me tell this story before. She taught the kids the song, Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere. Up, up, down, down, right, left, and all around. Everyone knows the song. It's a simple song and so on. But her principal of her school, who was a God-fearing, scholarly person, said to her, you can't teach that song. It's not true. Hashem is not up and down, right, left, and all around. Hashem is in heaven. And again, this represents not a mistake and not ignorance. This is an absolute perspective of much of the Torah-aware world. And again, this isn't born of ignorance. And just to take this a step further, he said, I can prove it to you because in the parsha that we'll read in a few weeks, before the giving of the 10 Commandments, Hashem, the verse says, the Hebrew is Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai. Now, every translation that's a standard phrase, it translates it as, and God came down onto Mount Sinai. So you see, God is in heaven. One time he came down onto Mount Sinai. He's not up, down, right, left, and all around. So this was very disturbing to her, not just because of the song, but because it's an absolute edict in Chabad that Hashem is here in this room. But this is a pasuk. So she did a little research and she looked in Onkelos, who was an interesting character himself. He was a convert. His uncle was the emperor of Rome. Anyway, he is the first person to translate the Torah. He translated Torah into Aramaic. And she looked in his translation. He translates it as Hashem is the Aramaic is the Isgalia Kutchabrichu Betura Desina, which translates as, and God revealed himself in Mount Sinai. So I know it sounds terribly condescending to say that I lowered myself to someone. It's not intended to be a judgment. It is the way that every teacher teaches, even if they're teaching graduate students. The whole point is that the teacher knows something that the student doesn't know. So the teacher has to teach the student by, and again, I use this word lowering, but I don't mean it in a disparaging format. That is, they have to present the information in a manner that is contoured to the recipient. In fact, next week is Yud Shvat, so appropriate to make a mention of a story of the previous Rebbe. We know the previous Rebbe's life was predominantly engaged in saving Jews from the Tsar, the communists, World War II, and so on. And he endured a lot of personal brutality. We know he was arrested when he was 11 years old. He was later arrested by the communists and so on. His own daughter and son-in-law were murdered. The middle daughter, Rabbi Shana, and her husband, Rabbi Horenstein, Hashem Yimkom Damav, they were killed during the war. Of course, so many of his Chassidim and the Jewish people. It was a very, very difficult time. But our Rebbe once commented that one of the most difficult parts of the Frierdiker Rebbe, or maybe even the most difficult, is that he didn't get the opportunity to speak in-depth Torah study because the world was on fire. Whereas our Rebbe, even though there's always difficulties and so on, but we have so many volumes of the Rebbe's academic teachings. Because look, what is a Rebbe? Ultimately, he's a teacher. Ultimately, he's a scholar. And yes, he has to be concerned with the community. In the times of the Frierdiker Rebbe, it was so overwhelming, that's where he had to put his energies. And he didn't get the same quantity of opportunity to speak. So if you want to do what you want to do, you do what you want. But if you want to do what is necessary for the people and to be in a relationship with the people, then you do what the people need. So if somebody knocks on your door and they're hungry, we give them food. We don't say, oh, let me tell you a Devar Torah I heard this morning. But that's what I like to do. I like to share a Devar Torah. Or the opposite, if somebody wants a Devar Torah, and say, well, I'm good at making tuna sandwiches. So Hashem, through this process of tzimtzum, which, like that principle said, well, Hashem is in heaven. Why does he suppose Hashem is in heaven? Because how could Hashem be here? I don't see him. So the pushback is, well, there's tzimtzum. And if Hashem was here in this physical room, this other position goes, we would see him. And the fact that I don't see him means that he's not here. But of course, Hashem is so unlimited that he can even be limited. And I know it sounds like a word game, but it's a truly profound and important point. So let's explain by this idea of tzimtzum. So again, there's this basic theological discussion. How does an infinite Hashem create the world? Paper clips, down to whether it's galaxies or the most smallest matter, because even a galaxy is ultimately limited. As we'll see, the Alter Rebbe quotes a statement in the Talmud that the journey from Earth to the heavens is a 500-year journey. Now, whether they mean that literally or it's the speed of light, but they don't say it's infinite. 500 is a number. Eventually you get there. Even if we say 1,000, 100,000, a million, eventually you get there. So the character of Hashem in this world is this befuddlement, because how does infinite get smaller? Even a little infinite is more than a lot of finite. And again, it's very much relevant to the whole episode of the Exodus from Egypt. Egypt is the extreme illustration of finite, the most achieved. And therefore, when you suggest the idea of infinite, again, you think about this in our own lives. You talk about infinite, people are like, what are you talking about? What do you mean infinite? We're about bigger, better. We were living through it where, the smallest thumb drive can hold more information than libraries upon libraries, but it still ends. At some point, even that ends. I mean, there is a finite number of stars in the sky and grains of sand on the sea, even if we could never know them. So this is the basic theological question. How does an infinite Hashem create a finite world? And the answer is this thing called tzimtzum. Tzimtzum means to contract. But what that means, how we understand that, is where you have this disparity between the original understanding, which is called literal tzimtzum, and the Baal Shem Tov's understanding, which is non-literal tzimtzum. Okay, so what is this? So originally the understanding was, right, Hashem pulls back and creates an empty space. And in that empty space, Hashem creates the world and all the functionality in the world, which nobody denies. Hashem is supervising, Hashem can intervene, Hashem can control it, he can destroy it. This argument, though, this school of thought goes that Hashem is not here, there, and everywhere. Hashem is not up, down, right, left, and all around. Hashem is in heaven. That's where Hashem is. And from time to time, he intervenes. He's always watching. Nobody's denying that. But he's not here in this room. As evidence, but in fact, look, you can't see it. He might be more evident in one place or another, but Hashem is not here in this room. That was the standard understanding, and it's referred to as literal tzimtzum. The Baal Shem Tov came along, and he said tzimtzum should not be understood literally, which means, pardon me, which means that Hashem is in this room. If Hashem is in this room, how come I don't see it? Because Hashem, out of his desire to give us a sense of identity, conceals himself. He is so infinite that he can even be finite. And you may recall, we've talked about it before, very simply, Rabbi Friedman's analogy of the homework, where the child's getting all frustrated, they're trying to do their homework, and they look to their parent and they say, what's the answer? So if the parent's primary objective is to be the hero and to have their child admire them, they tell them the answer. If the parent is more interested in doing what they want to do, and therefore they just sort of need to get the child to basically stop bothering them, they give them the answer. If the parent truly wants the child to develop their own skills, they don't give them the answer. But here's where you get the very delicate and difficult balancing act. There's a risk that the child feels completely abandoned. You're not helping me. If the parent just says, I'm not helping you, figure it out on your own, then the child feels abandoned. So the parent has to be very skilled, and every parent has done this, and sometimes we do it better and sometimes we don't, to very gradually and subtly coach the child along the process so that they can come to the understanding on their own with the assistance of the parent. Now, here the parent runs a big risk. One is the child feels like, well, what do I need my parent for? I did it on my own. Or they can feel resentment to the parent. You're not telling me because either you're incapable, you don't know, or because you're mean, because all the other kids' fathers tell them the answer. And you won't tell me the answer because, again, either you're not as strong as the other. This is what the Jews told Yirmiyahu, the prophet, when he rebuked them for their sinful behavior. And they said, look, when we serve Hashem, we're hungry. When we do the Averas, we eat. So we're not, we sell ourselves to the highest bidder. And other gods, if you work on Saturday, you probably will make more money than if you don't work on Saturday. And if you don't give tzedakah, you'll have more money. And if you don't keep kosher, you'll have more delicious food because you can, et cetera, et cetera. So that when the parent guides the child, they have to do it through a great delicate manner. Now, the objective is to give the child their sense of identity, and that the child should always feel that they're connected with the parent. That's a lot more work than just telling him the answer is 27, or don't bother me. That's the simple, easy way out. The easiest thing is to tell the child the answer because A, then he won't be bothering you. B, you like to do that because that's what the parent wants to do because they want to see their child succeed. And then the child thinks, oh, I have the best parent. Look, they gave me all the answers. But of course, as a result of that, the child never develops. So the work what's hard to do is to think about and strategize and come up with a plan to gently guide the child. That's the process called tzimtzum. Now, in the moment, the child might still feel abandoned by the parent. Well, just tell me the answer. Don't tell me where to look up. Just tell me the answer. So in that moment, the child feels like the parent is just being mean. Just pay for it. Why are you telling me to budget and save my allowance? Just give me the money. You have enough money for it. Just give it to me. So in that moment, the child may feel very resentful towards the parent, which is very hard for the parent. The parent is doing this out of love, and all they're getting is the sense of tension. So the parent has to do a lot of work to come to this strategy. So of course, the child probably doesn't recognize this. Hopefully one day they'll grow up, they'll become a parent, and they'll have this clarity. But if you're waiting for them to call up and say, thank you so much, as they say, don't hold your breath. So this is the process of tzimtzum that Hashem goes through. Hashem engages in this. And again, we're using human terms, which Torah permits us to, as it always does. The hand of Hashem, the Hashem thought, Hashem said, and so on. And the Alter Rebbe leans on that permission for us to speak in these terms. Hashem goes through this laborious effort in order to be in a relationship with us. So the strategy that the Alter Rebbe is going to employ here in chapter 48, which we will get to, I know I'm talking a lot, I'm sorry, is that if we understand this, it's not designed like, oh, you feel guilty, look how much work it is. It's to understand how crucially important it is for Hashem. So what we do is we respond in kind. That is, we tzimtzum. Just as Hashem would, so to speak, I use this term half jokingly, rather spend his time with the angels who appreciate him and understand him and speak his language and recognize it. And yet he doesn't do that because of his desire to be connected with us. Well, will we follow suit and put aside what we like to do? And again, we, including our animal soul and our physicality, which is to associate with the material matters in order to be connected with Hashem. So it's a little bit of a, you start to understand why they thought Hasidim was strange. I was saying Hashem puts aside the spiritual to engage in the material. And we are being, we evoke that we should put aside the material to engage in the spiritual. It's sort of upside down. the tendency is to think, well, God is about spiritual things and we're about material things, and we'll find some way to meet along the road. And what we're saying here is it's the reverse. Hashem is about the material and we're about the spiritual. Like the previous Rebbe said, Hashem gives a Jew material things in order that he, the Jew, should transform the material into the spiritual. Okay. Based on this, we're ready to start. Parak Memches, chapter 48. V'hine, and again, you see it begins with a Vav. I mean, we're continuing this theme about the more we understand what Hashem does. And this is one of the things that the Alter Rebbe, we didn't even get past the first letter. And again, I'm telling stories. The Alter Rebbe was criticized for, people were concerned about, troubled, which was, you're telling too many secrets here. You're sharing too much about what is important to Hashem and that this is meaningful to Hashem. And that's disturbing to people because it feels like that shouldn't be up for discussion. You don't tell people what Hashem wants and so on because they could be manipulative. They could say, oh, it's really important to you. Well, in that case, then you want this for you, then this is what I want for me. And we start falling into that mercantile relationship with Hashem. I'll do this for you if you do this for me, which, just to conclude that concept, the Gemara says, yes, if a person says, I'm doing a mitzvah in order to get a reward, he's a tzaddik, because right, ultimately it is important to Hashem. But for that, we don't need Tanya. Tanya is trying to get us to be in a connected, meaningful relationship with Hashem, not just trading an employment relationship. Ka'asher when yizbeinin hamaskil b'gdulas Hashem. Now, the Alter Rebbe says when a contemplative person will analyze. So here, the Alter Rebbe is following the same theme, and yet he is appealing to another characteristic, which is the intellect. Till now, in the last two chapters, when we talked about how Hashem takes the person out of the lowest stratosphere and brings them close to him. And we talked about how Hashem enables us to go out of our own Mitzrayims every day through the opportunity of Torah, kind of appeal to our emotional character. And now Hashem is appealing to our intellectual character. Again, the theme of these chapters that started back in chapter 46 is the person coming to the Alter Rebbe and he's saying, I'm not feeling a closeness with Hashem. So the Alter Rebbe began strategizing with the emotional response. The water reflects how Hashem loves you, evokes a love, etc. Here, as the Alter Rebbe says in this opening couple of words, that he's telling you to be Yisbeinin Hamaskil, when the intellectual starts to think about it. So now we're appealing to something that requires an intellectual awareness, like a child. I mean, again, a child doesn't understand the process of parenting. They just see their parent and sort of have expectations, and they don't think about it any more than they think about how the electricity works. I don't know. I know if I push the switch, the light goes on. I don't understand the depth of it. The more I understand the depth of it, the more appreciation I have of it, and so on. But it's not something that is a part of my consciousness until someone brings it to my attention. And that's what the Alter Rebbe is doing here in chapter 48. He's bringing this to our attention. B'gdulas ein sof baruch hu. Now, here's a phrase that we run into this issue. As we mentioned in English, and I guess also even ultimately in Hebrew, in language, that's probably the better way of phrasing it, you really can't have a word for infinite. Why? Because infinite is still, and I know this sounds like wordplay, is still limited to being infinite. And Hashem is not only infinite, because that's a limitation. Hashem is, I've told you the story 16 times. Hashem simply is. You can't say Hashem is a color. You can't say Hashem is an age. And you can't even say that Hashem is infinite, because that is already putting a limitation. So we say, well, what does infinite mean? It means so infinite that it's even finite. And again, it doesn't work with language, because language is designed to describe something. So language doesn't have a word for something that you can't describe, because even saying I can't describe it is a form of description. Again, I know it sounds like it's circular, but it's really important that we illustrate that point, especially here, because the Alter Rebbe is trying to awaken within us an awareness of again, I'll use this word, the effort that Hashem engages in to go from truly infinite into the finite, to go from infinite into the finite. Okay. Ki kishmoi kenhu, as his name is, so is he. And we talk about this so many times in Chassidus, the different names of Hashem, why it's sometimes Elohim and sometimes two Yuds and Yud Kei Vav Kei and Kel, and what I am is what I will be, etc., etc. That he is Ein Sof, there is no end, Ve'ein Ketz, there's no point where he runs out, V'tachlis, or any objective. Now, these are three words that generally are thought of as being synonymous. We know that in Lashon Kodesh, there is no real synonym, just like no two people are absolutely identical. So too, no two words are absolutely identical, because then it would be unnecessary. If you have two words that are literally, are completely, absolutely synonymous, and then what's the point of having these separate words? So in context here, it's important that we understand the nuance difference, because we're trying to, again, create that awareness of the infinity of Hashem, and thus the effort that is invested to create the illustration of Hashem within the finite. So, Ein Sof means no end. This is a common phrase that we have come across before. Chassidus asks a general question: why do we refer to Hashem as Ein Sof, without end? Why don't we call him Ein Techila, no beginning? Because again, no end suggests there's a beginning. Like numbers begin with one. Where do they end? They never end, but they do have a beginning. So does Hashem have a beginning? Well, ultimately not, but ultimately yes, because Hashem, as he's expressed to us, has a beginning. He has to start somewhere with the concept of it. So it begins somewhere. So since Hashem in his relationship with us has a beginning, we can only say that he has no end. Now, what is a ketz? A ketz is a point where it stops. Okay, at some point, this is going to run out. You know, it's like the old bumper sticker, Earth first. We'll strip mine all the other planets next. You know, at some point, you use it up and you move on. So there's no ketz. There's no point where Hashem runs out of having to be involved with this, with creation. And there's no tachlis. Tachlis meaning the ultimate purpose, but in this context, it means we're not trying to do something in order to do something. You know, the classic analogy that Chassidus uses is going on a journey. You know, you think about all the steps of going on a trip, and everything is absolutely crucial. Get up in the morning, get in the car, get to the airport, get on the line. But none of those are the tachlis. The tachlis isn't to get on the plane. The tachlis is to get to the trip or achieve the objective, whatever it may be. So everything else along the way is crucial, irreplaceable, but they're not the tachlis. So we might think that this world and Hashem's creation of this world has some other tachlis. And this is the explanation, that there isn't something else that we're warming up for. This is really where it's played. Now, this is another one of those issues, or it's a manifestation of the same issue about the non-literal interpretation of Tzimtzum, that is a dividing point between the way Chassidus understands it and others. What is the ultimate purpose? So some would say, what do you mean? This world is, as Pirkei Avos says, comparable to a waiting room, and it's a preparation for the world to come. So it's not the tachlis, but as the Alter Rebbe has told us earlier in Tanya, this is the entirety of humanity, and the ultimate purpose is these two words that we all know: dir b'tachtonim, dwelling place in the lower world, dwelling place in the lower world, dwelling place in the lower world. Again. It's all about dwelling place in the lower world. Why? Because this is where, pardon the silly term, the game is played. The game is played here. Here in this physical world is where the game is played. So when the Alter Rebbe says that Hashem has no tachlis, it means it's not like, okay, we finished that, now let's go on to the regular thing. This was all some sort of a warm-up. So these three words underscore the innate infinity of Hashem. So again, we're stuck because we're using words to describe something that's indescribable, but we have to approximate the best we can. L'or, to the light, v'chayis, and the life force, hamispashet, that is spread out, mimenu, from him, yisparech, b'ritzaynai haposhet, in his stripped down ratzon. So again, ratzon, and it's important, crucially important for us, what is the objective? What is it that we want? So when a person says, I want to eat, they don't want to eat, they want to be alive. They want the nourishment and so on. What is our ratzon? Remember the analogy of the journey. I want to get up on time. I want to get in the car. I want to get a parking spot. What is the objective? And knowing what it is. So the ratzon hapashut, again, the word pashut comes from the same word for skinning an animal, havshata, is stripped down. It's got nothing, it's got no other, I'll use this word, agenda to it. It's simply the straight up ratzon that is absolutely unified in absolute unity. It's an absolutely one with Hashem. So again, we know this about ourselves. We have a ratzon, but then we changes. We mature. Something grows old, becomes uninteresting, and so on. But Hashem's ratzon is an absolute ratzon. The closest thing that we would have, that I can think of, is our absolute ratzon that never changes. That is the ratzon to be alive, for the Gashmias, the ratzon to be connected with Hashem, for the spiritual. Those things have no wavering. They have no variety to them. They will always be. So Hashem's ratzon is absolutely his ratzon. And his ratzon is, as we've talked about, that this world, flaws and all, should be a place that welcomes him. That's the ultimate purpose. So creation is for Hashem's purpose, and he goes through all of this process because it's so important to him. Now, essentially what the Alter Rebbe here has laid out for us is an intellectual process, like we mentioned. This is not so much appealing to our character like the previous chapters. Here it's appealing to our character through our intellect. That mind rules the heart. The more we understand about the process that Hashem engages in, the more we become aligned. So he's talked to us about the Ein Sof, the limitless expression of Hashem's light. So there's no place that is devoid of God. And this was always that quibble is not even the right word, this disagreement, whether Hashem is literally in this room with me. Again, no Torah philosophy denies that Hashem knows what's going on and supervises and can, but whether or not he's literally in this room with me. And the aura that gives life to the world, the Ein Sof, is itself Ein Sof, meaning Hashem still retains that infinite characteristic when he's embedded in this world, meaning when the father is not telling the child the answer to the homework, at that moment, even though the child may feel disappointed or even worse, that moment is a moment of love that the parent is expressing to the child, even if the child doesn't receive it in that manner. The child is receiving it as a manner of frustration. And again, it's the ultimate love, because for the parents' own comfort, they just tell the kid the answer. Then their child is happy. Then they're happy. Then their child admires them, and so on. So even though at that moment the child is feeling frustration or even something harsher, that is actually a moment of great love that the parent is expressing to the child. So that's the infinite godliness is here, even when I don't see it, I just see the physical items here. And yet, not only is Hashem in this world, in this room, the infinity of Hashem, not just some token characteristic of godliness that he allows us to have some connection to. But again, really, he'd rather be somewhere else. And anybody who's ever had that experience of being with someone who'd really rather be somewhere else understands the shallowness of that relationship. So if the relationship is that this is the person who performs a service, they fix my teeth, they drive me in the taxi, fine. I don't expect them to be passionately desirous of being aligned with me. They're just doing their job. In contrast to someone who truly wants to be there. I mean, again, hopefully we've all had this experience at some level. I will venture to use a potential analogy. When a person finds themselves at their child's wedding, at Shul and Yom Kippur, they're not there saying, I'd really rather be somewhere else. But they want to be there. Now, we've probably also all been in circumstances where we really would rather be somewhere else. But, it's the thing, I have to go, whatever it is. So we understand the difference between being present and being present. Being there, like we would say, begashmius, in our physical presence, we show up, and being there with all of our focus and intensity and not saying, what time is this over, type of mentality. Well, this is what the Alter Rebbe is saying, that Hashem is here with all of his presence. Again, my analogy, like being in Shul and Yom Kippur, being at your child's wedding, whatever it is. You're not saying, man, I really wish I was, in the grocery store. Now we've also emphasized that it comes from Hashem's rutzon. It's not compulsory, so to speak. It's there. Hashem wants to be there. It's a conscious decision. I know we're using very human terms, which sounds, and again, others considered it borderline inappropriate, but the Alter Rebbe, Torah allows us, Torah allows us to do that, and the Alter Rebbe leans on this. Hashem makes that conscious decision, so to speak, every day to be there. He really wants to be here. And so when he chooses it, like we would say, every day. And it's a long chunk there. Now, the Alter Rebbe supports his argument that Tzimtzum is non-literal, because no matter how much Hashem could minimize his infinity, which on the surface sounds like, how can you minimize infinity? Well, we know about this even mathematically. You'll forgive my 10th grade geometry, but essentially a line is an infinite number of points between a beginning and an end. A plane is an infinite number of lines laterally, or whatever we call that, vertically. A cube is an infinite number of planes. So these are all different characteristics of infinite. If I start counting from 1 to infinity, I could start counting from 1,000,000 to infinity. They're both infinite, but they're different perspectives of infinity. So infinity could be minimized. But again, they're ultimately going to be infinite. You're never going to be able to package it. This is one of the reasons why, for example, Hashem appears to Moshe in a burning bush. Fire, it gives us a little bit of a glimpse of infinite. On the one hand, fire is finite. It can be measured in heat, it can be measured in brightness, it can be measured in space, but it can't really be contained like a physical commodity, like a stone. So it's got an infinite quality to it, and it has a finite quality to it. It's got both characteristics intertwined within it. Well, in a certain perspective, this is what we're talking about with Hashem. Because, and here, let's go through the terms now. Had Hashem simply compressed himself, and again, a classic illustration, because the teachers of Hasidus were all teachers, so that's where they start with, which is teaching. So all forms of teaching, whether you're literally in a classroom or any kind of instruction. So the teacher and the student have a basic disconnect. And this is why, although socially it's not always seen this way, The greatest teachers teach first grade, because for geniuses to teach geniuses is a lot simpler than for geniuses to teach first graders. So you have a child. The child doesn't know their aleph beis. They don't know chumash. You can't rely on their understanding. So the teacher is a grown adult. So the teacher knows poetry. They know chumash. They know Torah. So what do they like? They like to teach Torah. So you sit with, it's almost like a comic. You sit with a group of first graders and you start pontificating. They're going to think you're the greatest teacher. They're going to be incredibly impressed with you, but they won't learn anything. So you have to make a decision. Do I want my students to be impressed with me, or do I want my students to learn anything? Now, not only that, but you get the ultimate resentment, because what happens? That student will one day grow up. And unless they have a real intense level of maturity, they'll say, my first grade teacher was so dumb. All they knew was aleph beis. No, all you knew, or all you were able to know was aleph beis. I mean, again, I'm not here. It's a worthwhile discussion, because in our society, if the guy is the head of the kollel, everyone goes, oh, wow. And if they teach first grade, oh, that's cute. But it's the opposite, because you're communicating from the infinite level of the adult to the finite level of the child without relying, or without the crutch of the child knowing what you're talking about. Often in my Murim, it will quote a chasma, says, ki yadua, as it is known. And every yeshiva student goes, I didn't know that. So what it means is not that we expect you to know it, but I mean, we've already established it. We click here for more information, but it's sort of half a joke and not half a joke, right? They're relying on you to know something. You don't take a child and you put him in ninth grade biology. He doesn't know what you're talking about. But the kid comes to ninth grade, you expect him to have gone to eighth grade, 7th to 6th. So where's the hardest? The hardest is tachtoi chein tachtoi lamata heimena, translated as lowest, which is not meant to be disparaging, of which there is nothing lower. So what if the teacher will teach their concept in their way? I mean, again, it's so obvious that it's silly, but it illustrates the point. If you see, here's an adult sitting on the floor with puppets. This is ridiculous. It only makes sense because they're teaching first graders. Now we understand. But if I just saw an adult with hand puppets singing aleph beis, I think, well, this person is not developed. So the same thing with Hashem, and even greater, because look, ultimately, an adult and a child are still in the same genre, and Hashem is on the floor with the puppets, and he's infinite on the floor with the puppets. Why? Because no matter how much Hashem will tone down his infinity, we're never going to speak that language until he gets on the floor with the puppets. Now, in the moment, again, assuming that the teacher is not just annoyed and tolerating this, but they are fully engaged in the whole process. At that moment, the child, who can't, of course, appreciate it, is absolutely bonded. And again, you have a bad first grade teacher, it's like the scratching the seed. You ain't getting to kollel if you didn't have a good first grade teacher, because you never learned your aleph beis, you never learned your, whatever. It's as down the whole path. So this is what Hashem is doing here. And this is what the Alter Rebbe is saying. So I want to go through the words, meaning, if Hashem would have only gone in a reasonable process, hishtalshelus, the root of that word is shalosh, 3, which means a pattern. So had you only gone in a pattern from the infinite light of Hashem, without the tzimtzum, without the teacher saying, okay, I got to stop doing what I want to do, and I got to see it from the perspective of my student, because the teacher loves education, and they want to talk about the Chumash and the Talmud and the Medrash, but they got to teach the kid aleph beis. So they have to completely get outside of their own identity and completely become absorbed in the identity of the 5-year-old, and then completely absorb themselves back into their more mature level, because they can't be a 5-year-old. That's not going to help. And communicate with the 5-year-old. They say by the Frierdiker Rebbe that after Yechidus, he would be sweating. And people asked, wherever they asked, he said, what do you mean? A person comes to me, so they tell me their problem. So I think to myself, why is Hashem sending this problem to me? I got to get into their head. So I got to get out of my clothes. I got to get into their clothes. I got to understand the problem, not some dismissive thing, go through, say 3 chapters up the hill or whatever. And then I got to get back into my clothes, because if I'm in their clothes, I mean, I can't help them. I got to, and so it's exhausting. So again, the person who teaches the first grade is in this exhausting process, because they have to get into the mind of the 5-year-old, which is, it's not completely, but it's pretty close to far. Now imagine Hashem. I mean, look, ultimately an adult and a 5-year-old, the adult was 5 years old, and they're still human beings in the same genre. But not even that, huh? But so Hashem is infinite, and he's got to get into the mind of a human being. And then he's got to get out of the mind of the human being and be Hashem to the human being. Because if he's just another 5-year-old to a 5-year-old, it's not really helping them. So that's why he can't just go ishtalshalis. There has to be this radical change. If it just went in the way of cause and effect, you would never get this world the way it is now, which sees itself as its own world. Because as long as that secret is out, that it's really Hashem. So again, this is essentially our objective. It's Yosef. When we're reading the story of Yosef sending his brothers on this wild goose chase back and forth to Canaan, we know it's really Yosef all along. They don't. So what changes is not any factual circumstance. It's just, surprise, I am Yosef. Well, imagine if that's what Hashem wants us to do. Meaning, if we can know that it's really Hashem, then A, all the suffering goes away because we know it comes from Hashem. And B, we are then able to work back through the tzimtzum. But if Hashem just shows up and says, hi, I'm Hashem, we'll never be able to be developed as our own person. And again, how do we know this world is limited? This world seems pretty big, They used to say in England, they think 100 miles is a long journey. In the United States, we think 100 years ago was a long time ago. Our history is 250 years, and their whole country is the size of one state. This is an enormous country. You try driving from Miami to Seattle, you'll find out what a big country this is. This is just one country, and the size and the enormity. So this world appears to be pretty infinite, and the galaxies upon, but even that's limited. Like it says, it's a 500-year journey from the earth to the skies, which is kind of interesting. When the Alter Rebbe wrote this, that sounded like fantasy. Now we're doing it all the time, sending satellites and to Mars and Jupiter, and with his galaxies upon galaxies. So it seems infinite, but even that's not infinite. Even that couldn't exist, because even the guy in the adult needs a teacher who needs a teacher. Even that couldn't exist if Hashem just went full on infinite, even if he went a little infinite, because a little infinite is going to never be absorbed by the finite, except maybe to be a fan. We could be awed, say, wow, you're the best. But Hashem is not looking for fans. So all of this description, even for the greatest of tzaddikim, is still limited. Even for the angels are limited. The fact that we can describe something means it's limited. Now, again, we call it the chiddush, the innovation of chassidus was that where you're going to find infinite, here in this physical world. When a person does a mitzvah, they are accessing the infinite. I don't see it. So I don't see it. Why? Because I can't see infinite. I'm not sensitized to infinite. When the Rebbe spoke about what we call today, basic mitzvahim, people were like, well, who cares? Somebody does one mitzvah one time. But if we understand that every time we do a mitzvah, it's infinite. So the fact that yesterday I shook the lulav, I still have to do it today. The fact that yesterday I made a bracha, I still have to do it today. I had a mezuzah yesterday, I still have to do it today. It is infinite. So then we don't dismiss it as one time. What's the big deal? They did it one time. Because each time is infinite. That's why the fact that I did it yesterday doesn't count for today. Why not? Because each time is infinite, it's infinite. It can't be carried. There's no carry. It doesn't get carried over and say, okay, I'll do it today for tomorrow. Key, because the Alter Rebbe continues, Yesh gvul lahasagosam, v'orein soif, hameir olein b'slapshus Chabad. There is still going to be a limitation to our capacity to appreciate Hashem. Because again, this is that difficult balancing act. If we want, if the parent wants the child to know, or the teacher, the student, and Hashem wants us to know him, we've got to have some access point. There's got to be some connection. However, that connection is always going to be limited, because what happens, imagine the child comes in, you say they don't know anything. They're a total blank slate. The teacher teaches them Aleph Beit, teaches them a pasuk of Chumash. Take a simple example that we've all experienced. The kid learns the pasuk. Okay, now I know it. I'm done. Of course, next year you're going to come across it and you go, oh wow, there's a whole nother depth. Okay, but now I know it. And then you find the guy, he started when he was 5, now he's 105, and he's still learning it. Why? Because there's always going to be a greater and greater depth. As soon as we think we know, we've locked Hashem in. Now Hashem is willing to endure that. Just like the parent is willing to endure the child feeling resentment, the child's ridicule, as we talked about all the other kids' fathers tell them the answer, etc. Hashem is willing to endure that because of his desire to be associated with us. So what the Alter Rebbe again is heading towards is, look how Hashem puts aside his comfort because he wants to be connected with us. Will we do the same and put aside our comfort, which is to be associated with material, measurable manner, in order to be in a relationship with Hashem? And therefore, there's always going to be a limit to this is the malachim. And again, this is another one of those things that was very controversial about Chassidus. People did not like it. That the tzaddik and the malach, if they only act in that way, is going to be limited in their connection, in their relationship. Or Hashem. Because if they were, in fact, to have the full-on extent of the infinity of Hashem, they would get subsumed within that infinity. So as much as we understand about Hashem, which is a lot of what Chassidus is trying to do, it's always going to be limited because we are limited human beings and we understand things in a limited process. And this is why, although this isn't so much the objective here, but this is why there's such an emphasis in Chassidus on mitzvahs maisius, on mitzvah actions. Now, they're already back in the times of the Talmud, there was this tension between which is greater, Torah study or mitzvah action. And the Talmud concludes with a sort of a non-conclusion, says great is Torah study because it leads to action. So is Torah study validated by action? So there's many, many explanations that true study results in action. It's not an either or, the old, if you were stuck in a desert island, if you had, if the two trains are coming, that's not what you would do. You would say, hey, get out of the way. You would do something else. Life isn't about these rigid, separate choices. It's just not. So where is the emphasis? It's not one to the exclusion of the other. And Chassidus and Tanya, as we've come across already a lot, again, it's not one instead of the other, comes down on the mitzvah actions, because Torah study, although it is, of course, the manner in which we absorb the infinity of Hashem, is going to be limited to my capacity to understand, in contrast to mitzvahs. We have an illustration of this, but we've certainly talked about this before. When Moshe Rabbeinu dies, the Torah says that he was mourned by Kol B'nai Yisrael, all the children of Israel. When Aaron dies, it says he was mourned by Kol Beis Yisrael, the entire household of Israel. So, of course, we pick up on the difference. Why? So we explain, because Moshe is the one who brings Hashem down the mountain, and Aaron is the one who brings us up to Hashem. So, and again, in our generic categorization, Moshe is Torah and Aaron is mitzvahs. So Torah, everybody understands differently. This is the beauty of intellect and individual personality. We all understand Torah differently. So each person had a different relationship with Moshe, who's the teacher of Torah. Just like students can love their teacher, and each one, Rabbi Akiva's students, a famous sikha from the Rebbe, of course, everybody understood it a little differently because they are importing the information through the filter of their character. Aaron, who represents mitzvahs, so mitzvahs, everybody does the same. So therefore, it's across the board identical. So again, we have a tendency to say, well, which one is better? It's not. That's not the path that we're after. Which one is better? They're both necessary. What we're seeing, though, and here, as the Alter Rebbe is emphasizing, although this isn't the primary objective here, is that when we do mitzvahs, we are aligning with the infinity of Hashem. In contrast to when we study Torah, we are importing Hashem, but we're importing it through finite brackets that limit our capacity to grasp the infinity of Hashem. Okay, so we've created the awareness of the Tzimtzum, and what the Alter Rebbe is now going to align that with. So look at all the effort Hashem goes through to be connected with us. We should be so motivated to go through a similar type of effort to be connected with the infinity of Hashem. Okay, we'll stop here and we'll continue next Davach. All right.
Thank you.
Everyone should have a good week.
Thank you.
Good week.